I wanted to take a look at if Star Wars Jedi Survivor actually got fixed with patch 7 on PC. A lot of people had been waiting for this game to be fixed, and notably with the patch 7 update, they're no longer saying things that they usually did below. More on the way. More on the way. More patches are coming. They used to keep promising that more patches are coming. Do you guys notice that that is no longer the case on patch 7? Which implies that this might be their final state of the game. It does say it has performance and optimization improvements for PC. It's also added in DLSS support. It's unclear if they could have done that all along, despite the AMD's sponsorship, or whether or not that was a timed exclusivity thing. Maybe there was never any pressure there. Maybe AMD changed their mind on some of those deals after getting a lot of pushback with the lead up to Starfield recently. that made the news a lot. But anyway, with consoles, this patch has enabled a nice smooth 60 FPS mode, primarily by disabling ray tracing from the game. But with PC, a lot of the issues have actually been CPU related, which a lot of people didn't fully understand. This also gives me a chance to play with Intel's new PresentMon overlay for looking into CPU binds and things like that. And we can take a look at DLSS in the game. I believe we also have frame generation. And I threw together a mid-range PC for testing this, a Ryzen 5 5600X and an RTX 4060. Which, is pretty recent mid-range hardware, and we'll see if the game is running well now. Let's just hop in and see how it goes. A huge amount of the problems with this game's performance at launch was actually CPU related, not GPU related, and a lot of PC users have trouble identifying that. I think a lot of times they blame performance on the GPU if it's not running well, or the game for not running well enough on their GPU. But one reason why I'm using Intel's PresentMon software overlay here is so that we can see the difference between GPU busy time and the just actual frame time. Because if the GPU busy line is below the frame time, that means the GPU is mostly waiting on something else. And that's what we're seeing here, and this is a mid-range PC that I've loaded up. This is a Ryzen 5 5600X CPU, which is kind of the mid-range gaming CPU from AMD's lineup that came out, 2.5 years ago or so. And then we have the RTX 4060 in here. You can see that the overall frame rates running through the town of Kobo, where a lot of the CPU issues are exacerbated, are not good, and the frame time graph is extremely spiky. We can see that we're well below 60 frames per second, but you can also see, especially if you look at the average rather than the raw data, that the GPU busy line is significantly below the frame time average line. And that means that our performance issues here are mostly related to the CPU, not to the GPU. So if I stand still here, for example, now this actually relieves some CPU limit by standing still because it's no longer streaming in as much stuff off the screen. But what one of the big updates did to this game was it enabled DLSS upscaling as well as frame generation. And I'll apologize, you probably hear my kids banging on the ceiling above me. I'm recording in the basement while they play. Anyway. Now, some people might get confused by DLSS 3 upscaler versus frame generation. And the upscaler is more like DLSS 2 that you're used to, but there's a 3.x version of that you can use. That is just an updated version of that. And then frame generation can be enabled separately. The thing about upscalers, though, similar to AMD's FSR2 that was already in the game, is that they relieve the burden on the GPU, not on the CPU. So by going down to the performance mode, for example, you might expect the frame rate to go up. But if we look at it now, we're actually getting very similar performance, still well below 60 frames per second, despite that the game is now rendering internally at 540p rather than 1080p, and trying to upscale the result to a 1080p output. And if you look again at the frame time graph versus GPU busy, the frame time average is significantly ahead of the GPU busy line, and that once again is showing us that we are limited by the performance of the CPU, which again is a decent gaming CPU from just a couple of years ago. That really only got replaced with the newer version, about a year ago now, or less than a year ago now, actually, I think. So the point is, The performance on the CPU here is leaving a lot to be desired, and normal upscaling does nothing for that. Now, I will say that when you are upscaling extremely aggressively, the DLSS upscaler does look better than the FSR2 upscaler. If we try out the FSR2 upscaler at the same mode, again in the performance mode, so a 540p internal resolution when you're at 1080p, I think you guys would agree that the grass, the foliage, things like that, look a lot more pixelated and less well reconstructed at these extremely aggressive things. Also look at the characters' like arms as they swing in motion, the ground and the grass and things like that. Just watching characters move as they walk by, things like that. You can see a ghosting trail behind them. And so again, if I go ahead and switch back to DLSS 2 at the performance level, I think we will agree that the DLSS implementation here does allow for a better looking aggressive upscaling, although it's not solving the performance issue that we're running into in this town. Again, here at the performance mode, now if we watch the character moving in front of us, if you look like at their legs as they were trailing behind, it's not perfect, but there's a lot less ghosting. Once again, running around, I think the foliage looks a lot better reconstructed, closer to what 1080p should look like. And as the character's arms swing around and the ground and things like that come into view around it, again, it's still not a perfect upscaling, but the image quality is improved. So this update for users with an RTX GPU, 2030-40 series, from NVIDIA will benefit from a better looking upscaling option without having to resort to mods to enable it, with the implementation of DLSS upscaling into the game. However, as we just saw here, it did not at all solve the performance issues in this situation. Again, we're still kind of hanging out in the 40s, well below 60 FPS, because once again, it is a CPU limit and normal upscaling does not solve the problem. Now, users of NVIDIA's 40 series GPUs and absolutely no one else can now click on the frame generation button, which I'm going to do here. Now, frame generation will slightly delay showing us one of the actual game engine frames, and will insert a interpolated frame in between using motion vectors and partially actually rendering the next frame to kind of figure out what that frame should look like. Image quality wise, I've only been able to play around with this a little bit, and it looks pretty okay. I have noticed, I think, like flipping around the menus and things like that, as it changes screens quickly between them. I don't know how well this picks up, but I get kind of a garbled frame in between the the real frames as it switches between things that don't have anything in common. So that's one of the things that I noticed, and I'm sure that in actual gameplay and fast scene transitions, there may be some other image quality issues. But the fact that this game doesn't really have like a targeting reticle going on does help, because a lot of times that's going to be one of the things that you have problems with image quality on frame generation. However, it doesn't look absolutely perfect. And again, the higher your base frame rate is, the better this will work. And you can see here that we're still not necessarily able to get a smooth frame time graph. And the 1% lows, or as this software reports it, the 99 percentile numbers, are still below 60 frames per second. However, frame generation can increase the frame rate, although not the game's responsiveness, when you are CPU limited, because the game's engine is not really aware of those generated frames. It's not responsive to the physics or the input. So the downside of that is it does not improve the responsiveness of the game, but does improve the motion fluidity on a higher refresh rate monitor. But again, it doesn't actually improve the responsiveness of the game. But the trade-off there is that means that it does push through a CPU limit to improve frame rate, also only available on the 40 series. It'll be interesting to see if this game gets updated with FSR3's fluid motion frames once those become available. So what can we actually do for people without frame generation? And again, frame generation still didn't give us a real smooth experience. It was still pretty stuttery running through the city. It didn't solve all of our problems, but it was nice to have. So what could we do? Well, notice that ray tracing is still on right now. Ray tracing, while it does have a heavy hit on the GPU performance, it also has a heavy hit on CPU performance. So if I actually turn off ray tracing, and run around the town, we're actually going to notice that the GPU is now, if we look at especially the average frame time versus GPU busy average, they're much closer together, and we're much more likely to be actually GPU limited in this situation, and the overall frame rates are a lot higher. You can see that we're closer to averaging 60 FPS as we run around the town, but if you look at the raw frame time, there's still massive stutters happening. Those spikes on the frame time graph are bad. Those mean that it's not a smooth experience between frames here. We're getting a lot of stutters as we run around the town. However, this did relieve a lot of the burden on the CPU by turning off ray tracing. But again, it seems like the patch that they did didn't really solve our CPU-limited ray tracing performance in the game. Now that we're less CPU-limited, the normal upscaling techniques with the DLSS upscaler, not frame generation, and FSR2 upscaling should actually give us a bit more to work with here. For example, if I go to the, you know what, let's actually push it to the performance mode, not because I would want to use that at 1080p, but we should now be introducing another CPU limit to the game. By rendering the game at 540p internally and upscaling, we're now reducing the burden on the GPU significantly. And you can once again see that especially looking at the average frame time graph versus GPU busy line, now the GPU is now waiting. The GPU is not fully busy, its utilization is low, meaning we're now seeing the limitations of the CPU in this town, not the GPU. By choosing these settings, and we can see the frame time graph is still quite spiky. The 99th percentile frames, or in other words, the 1% lows, are still well below 60 frames per second, and but the average frame rate running around the town can at least average around 60 frames per second, depending on which exact piece of this that we are looking at. Anyway, with ray tracing disabled to now increase the baseline ability of the CPU, we can also kick on frame generation, again, if you have the 40 series card. And actually, first we'll leave on the DLSS upscaling. But now with these two things combined and with ray tracing turned off, it does look like our overall experience in the town is a lot smoother, but again, if you look at the raw frame time graph, there are still some large spikes, and if you look at the 1% lows, again, the 99th percentile frames, they're still dipping pretty low. So while frame generation helps relieve some of the CPU limit, it doesn't completely solve the problem. And again, for a lot of people, that's just not going to be something that's available to them anyway. Now, we could try V-syncing to like 60 frames per second, but VSync is not compatible with frame generation. But we could at least look at, okay, what does the frame time graph look like? By the way, you can force VSync through NVIDIA's control panel, so that's another way to get there, but in-game, it's gonna turn it off. Here we can show once again that, well, you can average around that 60 frames per second. If you look at the frame time graph, it's still very spiky, and we have dips well below 60, and again, that's a CPU burden. So basically, long story short, this update did not, while it's nice to have DLSS and frame generation implemented in the game, it doesn't solve a CPU bind, which is honestly the problem that most people are actually having with this game. It's actually much more CPU limited rather than GPU limited. I'm going to kick off VSync again for performance purposes. Now, I do think it's important to be fair and say that these populated town areas in the game perform significantly worse than most other areas on the game. So I do think it is fair to point that out. So if I run out of town, All right, I did fast travel out of the town because I wanted to show that other areas of the game are not going to hit CPU limits quite as low, like in that 50 to 60 FPS with ray tracing off kind of a situation. This is an area that I usually use when I'm testing out GPUs in the game, just because it's just less CPU limited. You can see that our frame rate numbers here are going over 100 frames per second much of the time. And if we look at our GPU busy line versus the frame time average line, we are kind of still showing off some CPU limitation here, but it is, like I said, much, much higher. We're over 100 frames per second much of the time. And so there are definitely areas of the game that do perform well, and I do want to mention that. But I just do think it's also important to note that the CPU binds, especially in the more populated areas, on anything other than just like crazy powerful hardware. And honestly, even then, you're not getting super super high frame rates. Just a little bit disappointing to take a look at, and I would say that the problem is certainly not completely solved. I was trying to just run past these guys for the purposes of testing, but anyway. All right, well, I think it's good that we have the new upscaling options. I think it's good that we have frame generation now, but I don't feel like the game just like runs great. Especially not in the town areas and with ray tracing enabled on CPUs. So don't think that most of the problems are solved, but hey, at least we got some upscaling going on. And I hope all of you have an excellent day.